Hi, and welcome to StoryWonk's Essentials series. This series of individual lectures is focused on giving you an introduction to the essentials of storytelling, and you can take them individually in any order you choose. Today's lecture, Structure and the 7 Anchor Scenes, will address what structure is, how it works, and why we need it. My name is Lonnie Diane Rich, and if at any point during these lectures you have any questions, please feel free to email me at lonnie@storywonk.com or visit the Structure and the 7 Anchor Scenes forum at storywonk.com/forum, where you can ask me questions and discuss what you learned here with other students taking the class. A note about this lecture. Structure is one of the things my students struggle with the most, and it often takes a while to fully understand how it works. Do not worry if you watch this lecture, listen to the audio a few times, and still don't quite get it. While you're smart and I have no worries about your ability to understand on an intellectual level, it can take a while for structure to sink in properly. It did for me anyway. I'll end the lecture with some strategies to help you absorb structure through your own independent work. Hey, it's watching movies. Best homework ever. I don't feel bad for you. And there will be exercises for you in the supplemental materials that come with this lecture. And now on to Structure and the 7 Anchor Scenes. This lecture is going to be divided into 4 parts. They are: what is structure? In this opening section, we will discuss what we mean when we talk about using structure in a narrative context, as well as why we need structure and why any structure will work. What the Greeks knew. It all goes back to Aristotle, baby. In this section, we'll visit classic Aristotelian narrative structure, which is the basis upon which most stories are built, even today. The 7 Anchor Scenes. In an attempt to simplify structure for myself, I broke classic Aristotelian structure into something I call the 7 Anchor Scenes. I'll tell you what these are, how they work, and how you can use them. Independent study. In this section, we'll talk a bit about how you can move on to analyze movies to help you better understand and internalize story structure. All right, so let's get started. What is structure? At StoryWonk, we talk a lot about the difference between magic and craft, so chances are good you've heard this before. Still, this difference is important, and it's a great starting point for discussing structure, so let's hit it again, quickly. Magic is that special spark that is you. It's your view on the world, your sense of humor, your values, your wit, your voice. It's what inspires you and what fuels you through all the hard parts of writing. Craft is what makes your magic accessible to other people. Craft is the rules, grammar, structure. Craft is a delivery system for your magic. It makes your magic something a reader can connect with by utilizing a common language of narrative. The important thing to remember is that in the Thunderdome, where 2 enter and only 1 leaves, magic wins. If it comes down to a choice between your magic and your craft, choose your magic every day and twice on Sunday. That's why it's magic. It wins. The good news is, very rarely will you come upon a situation in which your magic and your craft can't coexist peacefully. However, when you find yourself in a situation where craft is making your magic crumble into a corner, throw the craft out and go with your gut. All right, so let's get back to structure and what it does for you. You can look at structure as a dress form. You can make the most beautiful dress in the world, but without the form to hang it on, it's simply a bunch of fabric on the ground. Once it's on the form, however, other people can see what it is, can appreciate your magic because it's presented in a way that makes sense to them. So, structure is the dress form, magic, in other words, you, is the dress. By building a proper structure on which to hang your story, you make it accessible to your reader. You give your story a cohesive spine over which you can drape your magic. That cohesive spine is constructed of the scenes which you use, one after the other, to escalate your story from the start of the trouble to the climax of the trouble to the end of the trouble or the resolution, at which point your story is over. And that alone will provide you the most basic elemental structure. The trouble starts. The trouble gets worse. We're going to shove that between the start and the climax because things always have to get worse first. The trouble climaxes with victory or defeat for our protagonist. And then the trouble is over. Justice is restored. That's 4 beats, and they all have one thing in common: the trouble. We're going to get to that in a lot more detail later when we talk about anchor scenes, but I wanted to point it out now because it's important. I want you to kind of have that in your head as we move forward. All right, so back to structure. Now that we know what it is, let's answer the next natural question. Why do we need it? Earlier in this lecture, I mentioned that structure, the dress form, makes your magic, the dress, accessible to your reader. It makes it possible for your reader to look at the fabric that makes up the dress and understand your intention. That's true, and it's definitely one reason why we need structure, and craft in general. But it's not the only reason. The reason we need structure is because it gives form to our conflict, and conflict fuels the story. Without structure to hold up the conflict, which will then fuel the story, a story will not move. Well, right now, some of you are probably saying, wait a minute, I've written stories before and I didn't know anything about structure and they moved. I finished a novel and that story moved from beginning to end. Stuff happened. There was story there. I'm not really arguing that there wasn't. What I will say is that if stuff happened and there was story, then there was structure. When you move from one scene to the next, when you push story from one stage to the next, you use structure to do it. You build scenes upon other scenes, and there you go, structure. Every story automatically has structure. As you'll see when we talk about Aristotle, throughout your entire life of absorbing story, you have absorbed structure as well. And many of you will put it in your books without even thinking about it. All right, so why do you even need this lecture? If every story automatically has structure, why learn about it? Well, just because structure exists doesn't mean it's good. Automatic, instinctive structure can be really messy. It can be confusing and meandering and frustrating to read. When you employ deliberate, conscious structure, you avoid the many pitfalls that writers who don't think about structure very often find themselves falling into. Pitfalls such as having no clear line of conflict, having no clear goal for your protagonist or your antagonist, not knowing who your antagonist is, failing to move the story forward while you pursue an irrelevant story thread. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. It's not just about the final product being frustrating for the reader. It can be frustrating for you too. In those times when you know something is wrong, but you're not quite sure what, so you just sort of wander around the story until it picks up again. By familiarizing yourself with structure and the rules of craft, you will give yourself a toolbox with which you can go into your story, find what's broken, and fix it. And while we're talking about fixing it, let's just take one quick moment to address something here. Every writer has a certain optimum time during his writing process for bringing craft into the game. For example, I fall about here on the plotter-pantser spectrum, meaning I'm a writer who likes to make things up as she goes along, fix it in the back end, do everything by the seat of her pants. For me, it's imperative that I plan as little as possible, write in a white-hot frenzy, forgetting my craft until later. For me, I can't think about structure or craft until after I'm done. When I come back to my story during the revision process, I look at all my scenes, my characters, and story elements, and separate them into 2 piles, what works and what doesn't. The stuff that works, I leave alone. I don't analyze. I don't go looking for trouble. It works. That's what matters. I may break 1,000 rules of craft, and it doesn't matter. The magic is strong, and it's working. It's my job not to go traipsing in and making a mess where everything is fine without me. The stuff that doesn't work, that's when I need to bring in my craft. I look at what's broken and I analyze it using my craft toolbox. Then when I find something that's out of whack on the craft side, I use what I know to fix it. So the optimum time for me to utilize my craft is during my revision process. Otherwise, it gets in my way and trips me up, causing trouble along the way because I'm not trusting my magic. Now, this may not be the case for all of you. Some of you are going to be plotters, and you may need this structure and craft to be involved in the early stages when you're putting the book together. For some of you, craft will inspire your magic to come out and play, and that's awesome. I can't tell you what kind of writer you are, though. You have to figure that out for yourself. If craft is tripping you up while you write, try to ignore it until after the book is done and then apply it. That is absolutely legit. Okay, so now we've talked about what structure is and why we need it. We need to hit on one thing more before we move forward, and that is that any structure will work. I'm going to be talking about the most commonly used structures during this class, but it's important that you remember that these are not the only structures you can use. I will lead you through 4 acts and 7 anchor scenes, but in reality, you can do whatever you want. You can have 7 acts or 3. You can have 4 anchor scenes or 12. I'm teaching the most commonly used structures here, but you can vary them as needed depending on the story you're telling. You can base your story on the 4 seasons of the year, the 12 hours on the clock, the 22 major arcana cards in the tarot. You can do whatever you want, but you must follow these principles. Each act must be a different phase of the trouble. Each anchor scene must track the trouble of the story, which is the conflict between your antagonist and your protagonist. Each scene must escalate the trouble. In other words, things must be always getting worse. Notice a theme here? Structure follows the trouble. With that knowledge, you can make any structure work. But that's all varsity level stuff, and we're not quite ready for that yet. So let's settle back into familiar territory and talk about classic narrative structure, which most of you know cold, even though you may not know you know it. So what we're going to do now is move into what the Greeks knew. In Western culture, stories have been following a basic pattern for thousands of years, and to this day, a good 90% of the books you read and the movies you watch will be based, to some degree, on narrative structure as it was defined by Aristotle. Since we will be bastardizing this structure for our own purposes later, let's go ahead and give the man his due by taking a look at classic Aristotelian narrative structure. And now you can pull that out at your next dinner party. Well, you know, in classic Aristotelian narrative structure, you'll be the belle of the ball, baby. But before we start showing off, let's take a closer look at Aristotle. Aristotle spoke about dramatic structure in his essay, Poetics, which covers epic poetry and other forms of narrative as well as plays, most of which he refers to as tragedies, but his thoughts can be applied more universally. Today we're going to focus on what he had to say about these plays. Now, if you haven't read Poetics, you can find it free around the internet. It's short. Actually, it wasn't intended for publication. These were Aristotle's lecture notes for himself. And it's fairly interesting. If you're going to show off at the dinner table, it'll be much more impressive if you can add, well, while I was reading Aristotle's Poetics. Anyway, Aristotle had many things to say, some of which we reject out of hand, such as the idea that a story needs to take place in no more than 24 consecutive hours, but some of which have stayed with us. The big thing being this: he was the first to talk about structure. These elements have been employed, we may say, by the poets to a man. In fact, every play contains spectacular elements as well as character, plot, diction, song, and thought. But most important of all is the structure of the incidents. In Poetics, Aristotle talks about a lot of things, including the suffering scene, which maps to our own dark moment. We're going to talk about that later. And I think it's a great idea to read it slowly, absorb what you can, see what he actually had to say, because when I did that, I came across a surprise. Aristotle's contribution to classic story structure? A whole is that which has a beginning, a middle, and an end. That's Aristotle's 3-act structure: a beginning, a middle, and an end. Can't get much more vague than that, but that's what we base everything on ever since. I find it kind of, if you'll forgive the term, poetic. Look how simple and clean and straightforward that is. A beginning, a middle, and an end. But of what? I mean, if you start writing right now, does your beginning start with your first word and your end finish with the last, no matter what those words are or what they mean? No, because you have to focus on the whole part. For a whole to be whole, it has to have everything it needs. And your whole, your story, is based on trouble. Overlay trouble onto Aristotle's 3 parts or acts, and there you go. We have the beginning of trouble. Hey, there's a rich, hot new guy in town, but he's kind of a jerk. And the middle. I kind of like him, but now my family is ruined and he'll never have me. And the end. Family saved, he loves me, yay, we're getting married. all of which are based on the trouble. So that's how our structure is going to work. It's going to focus on the whole of the trouble, which starts with a T, which rhymes with P, and that stands for plot, which is basically your structure, but that starts with S, and it just doesn't roll off the tongue quite the same way. Sorry, sometimes I see a Music Man reference and I just can't pass it up. Okay, so here we have the basic structure upon which you can build any kind of story. Mystery, romance, suspense, thriller, Jane Austen and zombies, whatever you want, there must be trouble, and it must have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Still, that can be a little amorphous for many of us, so I'm going to show you how I've broken this down into a rough format that involves 4 acts, 7 anchor scenes, and a partridge in a pear tree. Well, okay, fine. There's no partridge. Well, maybe Keith. No, forget it. No. No partridge. All right, let's move on. We've defined structure. We've talked about Aristotle. So now let's move on to the basic structure we're going to be using for this class. The 7 anchor scenes. My system for building and analyzing structure comes from my contention that for any structure to work, you must have a spine that holds it together. In a similar fashion to how small parts called vertebrae come together to form the spine, so will our anchor scenes come together to build the spine of your story. But before we get to the anchor scenes specifically, let's take a step back and look at our whole, the story. The story is the biggest unit of conflict that we have, and remember, all trouble is based in conflict. It is the big box, the whole enchilada, and it's huge and it's a little unwieldy. So let's break it down into smaller, more chewable bits, which we're going to refer to as acts. Acts are smaller units of conflict within the big unit of conflict, the story. So our first act is our beginning, right? But not just the beginning, meaning the first words that show up when we start typing. It's the beginning of our trouble, which is defined by a protagonist, your main character, and an antagonist, your villain, in conflict over a mutually exclusive goal. Both can't win. If one wins, the other has to lose. And just so you know, there are going to be other StoryWonk Essential lectures talking about protagonist, antagonist, and conflict in much more detail. We can't cover all of that here, or all of our brains will explode, and that's really messy, but keep checking at StoryWonk.com and look in the classes section to see when that essential lecture shows up. Okay, so the first act is the beginning of the trouble. The conflict starts, and our protagonist has to A, recognize that trouble has begun, and B, decide what she's going to do about it. That's our beginning, and it takes up roughly 25% of your final story. And by roughly, I really do mean roughly. If I catch any of you cutting or adding words to hit 25,000 words on the dot in an exactly 100,000 word manuscript, you'll be in huge trouble. These are rough estimates. If you go more than 5% either way, you're going to want to beware of pacing issues, but really, it's a rough estimate. Okay, so then we get to the middle. The middle is when your protagonist looks the antagonist in the eye and says, "Not on my watch, baby." The protagonist uses her skills and knowledge to take on the antagonist, and in the middle discovers that it's going to be harder than she thought. As a matter of fact, this fight is going to be harder than anything she's ever done in her life. The middle is about the trouble escalating and things getting worse. The middle is roughly 35% of your total manuscript. But remember, there's a lot of leeway in there. After the middle, we get to the last act, what Aristotle so edifyingly called the end, which is about the end of the trouble. Your protagonist faces the challenge, learns to fight harder or in a new way in order to meet the antagonist head on, and in this act she has some success. Yay! Which of course makes the antagonist push back even harder. And in the final climax, your protagonist wins, and yay, the trouble is over and the story is done and everybody's happy. Which is great, except, well, it's a little abrupt. I don't know about you, but I need a little cuddling afterward. I want to see that justice is restored and that my protagonist has a happy ending and that all is right with the world from here on out. So that's why I split the last act into 2 parts. Act 3, which has the big fight up until the climax, and then Act 4, which takes us through the denouement or falling action, otherwise known as our resolution, also known as our HEA, or happily ever after, in which all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of thing shall be well. Act 3 tends to be roughly 20% of your total manuscript, and Act 4 tends to be about 10%. Okay, one quick thing here. I'm approaching this in a structure that leads toward a happy ending, but I just want to say, for you wannabe Russian novelists out there, that's not the only path to greatness. You can absolutely have a legitimate ending in which things do not end happily. Dr. Horrible's Sing-Along blog is a fabulous example of exactly this, and that's okay. It's completely legit. Maybe your protagonist sacrifices his life in the climax and wins a happy ever after ending for everyone but himself. Maybe your protagonist loses so much that even in victory the cost is too high. Battlestar Galactica, anyone? All of that is okay, but you still need your fight, and you still need to show us what happens to the world in the aftermath of that fight. The message you send about how the world works is all part of your magic. And if you want to get all Tolstoy on us, go right ahead. I'm a happy ending girl, and most fiction follows this course, so that's what I'm going to use in my examples. But if you want to bummer it up at the end, you go right ahead. All right, so here we are with our 4 acts and what each act represents. So we've got the trouble starts, the trouble gets worse, trouble is conquered, and the world is restored to justice. Still, those acts are big chunks, and while it helps to know what you're trying to accomplish in each section of the book, you still need one more thing. You need your spine, otherwise known as your anchor scenes. All right, so let's get down to it. What are anchor scenes? Anchor scenes are a series of important scenes in which major story movements occur, escalating the story and pushing it forward toward its conclusion. In my basic story structure, I have 7 anchor scenes. These anchor scenes track the main conflict between your main protagonist and your main antagonist. These anchor scenes are all owned by the protagonist in the protagonist's POV. The first 5 anchor scenes also denote rising action, which simply means things are constantly getting worse up until the climax, which is the battle, and your 6th anchor scene. So let's go ahead and lay out all the anchor scenes one by one so we can get a feel for how this spine works. All right, the first anchor scene is the inciting incident. The inciting incident must be in the opening scene of your book. Yes, I know, people have told you that you must set everything up first. You have to establish character, the ordinary world, etc. It is my argument that starting your trouble and establishing character are not mutually exclusive. You can do them both at the same time, and I highly suggest that you do. Also, the inciting incident, the beginning of the trouble, doesn't mean you have to have your big bad, your story antagonist present in the first scene, twirling his mustache of evil and tying some poor girl to a train track. It is only the influence of the antagonist that must be felt. Whatever trouble the antagonist is stirring up, the influence or promise of that trouble needs to be present in that opening scene. It does not have to be obvious. It does not have to be explicit. The protagonist does not have to be consciously aware of the trouble, but there needs to be a sense that something isn't right. At the end of your opening scene, your reader needs to be worried about your main character. All right, so I liken this to the movie Jaws. Here we have this lovely woman just minding her own business and swimming buck-ass naked in the ocean at midnight. What could possibly go wrong? Well, at first it seems pretty innocent, pretty safe. She's a good swimmer. She's got a lot of buoyancy going for her. It isn't until the first strains of the Jaws music shows up that we know something is wrong. Now, in Jaws, she's immediately eaten up, and she's not our protagonist, and the trouble is made explicit when the chomp chomp happens, and there are a lot of problems with the structure of Jaws. But I just want you to remember that feeling you got before you saw the shark, but when you heard that music. Okay, you were at Jaws, so you knew she was going to get eaten by a shark, but what I'm saying is that, if you didn't know, if you went into that movie completely blind and had no idea what it was about, when you heard the music, you worried about her. You didn't know what it was that was going to come and get her, but you worried. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about Jaws music. That's what your reader should be feeling by the end of your very first scene. Your reader should know that something isn't right, even if your protagonist doesn't. And that's all you need for your inciting incident. Okay, so let me just address the one most frequent argument I get on this subject from my students. But in such and such a movie/book, the trouble doesn't start until so many scenes or minutes in, and it's great. Okay, my first rebuttal of this argument is the idea that just because something has been published and or produced, it's a perfect paragon of storytelling. This is actually so rarely true as to be depressing. Yeah, sure, the person got away with it, but they succeeded despite that failure in the storytelling, not because of it. My second rebuttal is, with the example of a movie, it's still not tight storytelling, but movies have a lot more leeway than books do. When a viewer goes to a movie, he's just paid a month's rent on tickets and popcorn. He's in for the long haul. If it takes 20 minutes to get the party started, he's just going to snack and relax. He's passive. All he has to do is sit there until things start happening. We don't have that luxury with prose. First of all, our reader is probably reading the first scene for free, either at the bookstore or via the free sample that's given out on e-readers. Also, she's not passive. She has to be actively involved in reading and imagining the story we set forth. If we don't make it compelling and fast, there's no motivation for her to keep with us instead of moving on to something else. Also, something you really need to think about, there are almost 300,000 books published in the United States every year now, and that's not even taking into account all the self-published books that are out there. There are about 500 movies produced in a year. Our competition is stiffer, and what we require of our audience is greater. We need to work harder and be better, and starting your trouble at the start is how you do that. My third rebuttal is, I don't care what the other kids do. I'm raising you to know better. Your story starts when your trouble starts. That's it. Now let's move on. The second anchor scene is at the end of Act 1, and it's the acceptance of trouble, the Act 1 turning point. There are 3 turning points in this structure, all denoting the transition from one act to the next, and they are all defined by a choice your protagonist makes. Why a choice? Because story is about character, and characters change when they make a choice. That's what defines each act. They're about your character's relationship with the trouble. Once he makes a choice, that relationship changes, and you're on to the next phase. By the second anchor scene, the acceptance of the trouble, your protagonist knows there's trouble and has a pretty solid sense of what it is. And she also knows that she has to take on the fight to get rid of the trouble because she's the only one who can. There's still plenty of room for surprises, but we should have seen the main antagonist by now, even if the protagonist or the reader is still unsure who the antagonist is. It's okay to have a few underlying antagonists here, but the anchor scenes track to the conflict between your protagonist and your main antagonist. So this anchor scene needs to involve that antagonist, that main conflict. Again, your antagonist does not have to be actually present physically in the scene, but the influence of his actions must be felt. And it is at this point that your protagonist knows there's a fight ahead and that she must take it on, even if there are still unanswered questions about the fight. The third anchor scene comes in the middle of Act 2, in which we have our story midpoint, which is an event which escalates the conflict in a meaningful way. A big death that serves to motivate your main character can happen here, or maybe the discovery that a friend has betrayed her in this fight. The midpoint often denotes a reversal of fortune. Aristotle referred to this as the reversal of the situation, in which false assumptions are revealed, a surprise is encountered, a game changer enters the stage, and nothing is what we thought it was. You don't have to have a huge game changer here, but if you've got one in your book, this is where you want it. The fourth anchor scene comes at the end of Act 2, and it is the Act 2 turning point when your protagonist recognizes that this fight is bigger than he is, and in order to win, he must change. He's tried everything he can think of and still hasn't managed to defeat the antagonist. In order for him to move forward, he has to change who he is. He must stretch himself to become something more in order to meet this challenge. This is often known as the point of no return, because after this moment, your protagonist is always going to be a changed person. He can never go back to being the person he was before. And with the beginning of Act 3, up until the Act 3 turning point, this new changed protagonist is fighting harder and smarter than ever before. This is when he starts to see real success, real movement, and that success results in the antagonist fighting back harder as well. This escalation in the conflict results in the fifth anchor scene, the Act 3 turning point, in which the antagonist has escalated things to a life or death situation. Loss can mean actual death, or death in a figurative sense. And your protagonist wonders if he can actually win. This is also often known as the dark moment, when the doubts creep in and death or failure seems a grim inevitability. But your protagonist finds within him the strength to keep fighting, even as the losses pile up and the hope of victory fades. From the fifth anchor scene, the dark moment, that third turning point, we move into Act 4, in which we have the sixth anchor scene, the climax or the battle. Your protagonist uses everything he's learned in the process of the story to fight the antagonist in this final penultimate battle, and meets with victory, or defeat if you want to be all Tolstoy about it. From there, we move into the seventh anchor scene, or the resolution. This is the denouement, in which action falls, and we see the protagonist enjoying a world restored to order. This is our happy ending, in which the protagonist reaps the rewards of her hard work and our antagonist is punished. Or it's a bittersweet ending, in which our protagonist restores justice to the world, but at an incredibly high personal cost. Or our bummer ending, in which our protagonist gets run over by a train. How you handle this part of the story shows what you believe about how the world works or doesn't work. This is where your theme comes into play. Maybe good always triumphs, or love conquers all, or honor leads to death, whatever. How you end your story, how you wrap up your resolution, says everything you want to say about the nature of the universe. So, okay, wow, that's a lot of stuff. 4 acts broken into thematic blocks, 7 anchor scenes tracking the main conflict between the antagonist and the protagonist. So what about all those other scenes in between? What happens there? I'll tell you what happens there. Things get worse. Between your anchor scenes, you'll have smaller moments and subplots, but every scene needs to escalate the overall conflict. At the end of every scene, things need to be worse, more complicated than they were at the beginning. Does this always mean bad news? Not necessarily. In Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, Indy discovers where the Ark is, which is great, and then he finds Marion alive, which is great, and then he has to make a choice. The Ark or Marion? Complicated. See what I mean? Even when things seem good, they need to make the big conflict harder, more complicated, tougher to navigate. Is your head exploding yet? Don't worry. You can watch the movie of this lecture or listen to this audio over and over again, and every time it'll make a little more sense. But I need you to hold on because we're not quite done yet. We've hit on what structure is, we've taken a stroll around the park with Aristotle, and we've broken up story into neat little units of conflict called acts, and held up those acts with anchor scenes. Now we need to talk about your independent study work. All right, the best way to learn and internalize story structure is to watch movies, analyze them, and make your own decisions about how well or how poorly they work. Why movies instead of books? Because story is story is story. The format will have an effect on the specifics of how you express that story, but we're boiling things down to their essence now, and movies will give you the strongest hit of story in the least amount of time. Also, sometimes I need to point out what doesn't work, and I don't like publicly criticizing other authors. I consider them colleagues, and I won't tear them apart, not even to teach. Now, if you want to use books to work on these concepts, go right ahead. These principles will apply to novels as well. But for our purposes, I'm going to be talking about movies, and I recommend, to get the most bang for your time investment buck, that you do the same. In the packet that came with this lecture, you received analysis sheets for 6 movies. These are movies I have chosen for various reasons. Dodgeball is a great example of using story structure as a basis on which to hang your magic. Tangled has a fabulous antagonist. Shaun of the Dead has unusual story structure. So we're going to go ahead and start with Dodgeball. Print out the analysis sheet provided with my commentary and watch the movie to see how everything lines up. This will give you an idea of how story analysis is conducted. Make notes of anything you disagree with and be sure to think critically. It is not important that you always agree with me, even if I am always right. You need to know what you think, not what I think. Next, pick one of the other movies on the list, but this time don't print out or look at my analysis sheet. Print out the blank one and fill it in as you go, figuring out for yourself where the anchor scenes are and who the major players are. Then go back and compare your notes to mine. How are they different? How are they the same? Most importantly, what do you think? Come to the forums and argue your points. Maybe you'll convince me I'm wrong. It doesn't happen very often, but it's really fun when it does. All right, so continue through the list, as many or as few movies as you wish to do. Watch movies that aren't on my list and analyze them using the blank story analysis sheets. The more movies you watch, the more you'll be able to internalize structure. Also remember, just because it was produced, just because it was successful, just because it won awards, doesn't mean it's perfect. Be prepared to think critically and pick out the problems as well as the successes of the stories. Once you've done this, go through the story structure sheet and fill out your story beats on it. Remember that your anchor scenes track the conflict between your protagonist and antagonist, and everything between the anchor scenes up until the climax is where things get worse. And that's it for story structure and the 7 anchor scenes. Be sure to return to this lecture as often as you need to understand the major points. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email me at lonnie@storywonk.com or dive into the forums at storywonk.com/forum to discuss things there. I'll be answering questions there as well. Thanks so much, and see you next time.